By our work we are changed. Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of the Actual Magicians. Yes, I am an Actual Magicians bookshelf, where today we're going to be looking at occult psychology, or perhaps the occult and psychology, or the occultism of psychology, or psychological occultism, depending on how we approach it. And today we're going to be covering psychosynthesis. We're going to be taking a look at that. Going to be making a reference to how this relates to Gurdjieffian work, the Fourth Way work, particularly through the works of J.G. Bennett. We're going to briefly touch on that, but mainly through psychosynthesis. And I'm also going to be recommending another book, which is The Spiral Path, Spiritual Psychology by Edith B. Schnapper. We can see here. But first of all, I'd like to address, an elephant in the room, which is Jung. Jung and occultism, Jung and esotericism, is perhaps a connection that gets too easily made. Now, we're not going to touch on Jung and the archetypes and the unconscious in a Jungian sense today, but I did want to point out this is the largest book that I possess, I think, the Red Book, Liber Novus, Reader's Edition. Now, this is quite a large book, obviously. It's quite a thick, detailed book, but this is the Reader's Edition, because the actual largest book I actually have is Jung's Red Book. And this is an incredible piece of work. It's Jung's basically inner workings, his inner mind. And we can see, if I can hold it up for you here, the sort of illustrations that Jung was making in this book and the writing that he was doing. And the Reader's Edition is a sort of transcript and guide through this particular book. But you can see how occult the symbolism is. And one of the things that we are going to be taking a closer look at is models of the self, because occultism and psychology are interested in the sort of mandalas of the self. How is the self constructed? How is it made? What's inside it? How do we operate ourselves? As it said in one of the Hermetic axiom of know thyself, and that's one of the things we're going to be mainly taking a look at, is how all of these models, particularly with regard to psychosynthesis and this book by Jean Hardy, Psychology with the Soul, how these models actually work, and particularly how they relate to Kabbalah. My particular interest is in how these models can be mapped by the Sephiroth and the paths of the Tree of Life, and of course then the tarot cards and the stages of initiation. So we're going to be taking a look at a rare Crowley exhibit, a set of notes dictated to Norman Mudd in about 1923, where Crowley laid out a map of the self on the Tree of Life, which isn't often known. It's not really looked at, I don't think. So we're going to be taking a look at all of those things. Also, before we begin, I want you to pick a number between 1 and, let's say, 10. There's 17 of these will sticks here, and I'm going to ask you to pick a number between 1 and 10, and towards the end of this Magician's Bookshelf episode, I'm going to be asking you to think of that number, and we're going to pick you a will stick and look at some of the practical methods you can actually use occult psychology in your own everyday life, because I'm very keen to do that. But first of all, let's take a look at, I guess we'll start with psychosynthesis. Psychosynthesis was developed by Dr. Roberto Assigoli, who lived between 1888 and 1974. He was a student of both Jung and Freud, but sought to go beyond psychoanalytical processes of the time and make it more transpersonal, make it more synthetic of transcendent experience. He was familiar with the work of Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way, and as we'll come to see, some of his work actually parallels the work that Aleister Crowley was doing on the will, the true will, and thelema. In fact, I've come to believe over the years that the most valuable resource that we have is attention. It's not time. It's really what we do with that time, and what we do follows our attention or intent. And Aleister Crowley said, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, not is the whole of the law." That is to say, it's always a state that we are preparing ourselves for and practicing towards, rather than a state that we're actually in. We cannot will to do something in the present moment. We can only will to do it in a future moment, even if that's only a moment away. So where our attention is sat guides that in much the same way that a rudder guides a boat. It's not where you are looking to, it's where the rudder behind you is actually tilted that actually directs your progress in life. Crowley developed what he called, or what has become known as, the egg diagram. And we can see it on the screen here, where we have in the center, number 4 and number 5 are the conscious self, or I, the sense of being a conscious self, in the center at number 5, and the field of consciousness at number 4. And those of you who watched my video on NLP will see some relationship of this to my triangular model of a human being, which is all to do with values, time, space, and self-identity. This is another layer of a similar map. At the top of the diagram, we have 6, the higher self, which again, there's a lot of confusion about, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, other than to say it's a transpersonal or transcendental sense of self-identity. And underneath that self, that transcendent self, is the higher unconscious, as Crowley pointed out, or superconscious mind. That's in area 3. And below that we have the middle unconscious, which is where our memories are formulated, a more everyday level of unconscious. And then number 1, the lower unconscious, the very deep unconscious, where all of our philosophical, scientific models actually begin, and also our states of, as Crowley put it, contemplation, illumination, and ecstasy are all latent here to be drawn up to the top of the egg. Now, Crowley's work really looked to break down the partial senses of selves, all of the fragments of self, the sub-selves almost, and then once we've broken those down and recognized them and freed ourselves into a state of a singular self that is aware and awake in the fourth way Gurdjieffian sense, that we can then collect all of the other aspects of self and begin to function from a centered, consistent, congruent, comprehensive point of being, and work with the higher unconscious, the collective unconscious, and the transpersonal self, and bring all of those together to the work. Now, Crowley in Psychosynthesis does have a really interesting set of questionnaires for general assessment, and these are some questions you might want to ask yourself. Who do you consider as ideal models? Which men and women of the past and the present do you appreciate and admire most, and why? Which are your favourite books and the ones that you have most enjoyed and benefited from? Which books have caused you harm? In what way? Which poems and novels do you like most, and why? Do you prefer pictures or statues? Which of those do you admire most, and why? Which public buildings, churches and monuments over your life have attracted your attention the most? Do you like music and singing? Which song and which piece of music do you like best? What do you prefer, the theatre or the cinema? Which film has impressed you most? And which film gave you the greatest pleasure? Did any films have a bad effect on you? Which ones? In what way did they hurt you? And these questions go on all the way up to preferring to be in the country, the sea, the town, and why, aspects of your inner life, your attitude towards religion, spiritual reality, and so forth. And these are basically to analyze and draw out in conversation all of these sub-selves, the partial selves, the selves which are driving attention towards certain things more than others, because each of us is unique. And once we begin to isolate these through discourse, through dialogue, through other work, through contemplation, meditation, dream analysis, and so forth, we can begin to collect together these fragments in a almost Kabbalistic way, collecting the fragments together and binding them back to a sense of self. In fact, there's a later exercise where we work in disidentification in psychosynthesis, where we say, I have a body, but I am not my body. I have emotions, but I am not my emotions. I have desires, but I am not my desires. I have an intellect, but I am not my intellect. And we begin to disassociate ourselves from attachment and hence identity with these aspects of awareness. These are the aspects of awareness that arise within our psyche, within our relationship to the world, but they are not the ground state of our identity, our awareness, our unity with the entirety of reality and existence, which is the transcendental state that is only transcendental to the illusion of a separate identity. And this is where occult psychology takes a big jump from everyday psychology in looking at the more transcendental, or dare we say spiritual aspects of the relationship of self and universe. So the books that I would recommend for psychosynthesis are the collection, particularly the introduction by Aleister himself, Psychosynthesis, the book. And then before going on to the others, I would recommend A Psychology with a Soul, Jean Hardy, which we're going to take a look at in a moment, because this really gives a more contemporary overview of psychosynthesis itself. And then the two core books are What We May Be and The Act of Will. And here we can see the correlation or the parallel with Thelema, because Aleister was very interested in will, direction and attention. And this is, again, as I say, our most important resource is where are we placing attention. My occult teacher used to tell me that we become that by which we surround ourselves, or an alternate version of that is we could become that which we fight. And over the years, I've seen that more and more, that we do indeed become what we surround ourselves by. And so it's very important to surround yourself by the things that sustain you and help you develop. And you also become that which you fight, which just needs some sort of recognition that quite often when you are in conflict with something or somebody, that is really a really important lesson. And obviously that goes into inner child work, shadow work on the base level of our psychological model as well. But the act of will is where my little will sticks come from. And so if you've not thought of your number between 1 and 10, then please do so now, and we'll take a look at those towards the end of this video. So those are the books that I really recommend. So let's just take a quick look at the egg model applied, I guess, to Kabbalah through psychosynthesis and why that's important. Jean Hardy actually states that Aleister's picture of the superconscious and the relationship to the self is, she puts it, depicted somewhat more precisely in the Kabbalah. This is why I love the Tree of Life as a model of the self, because it is quite unique and accurate, I found, over time. Jean Hardy also talks about the subpersonalities of the good child, the manager, the rebel, the ideal parent, and how these relate to a continuum of love and will, which again, for those of us interested in thelema, we have a spectrum that follows love and will and change and maintenance. So, for example, a good child is love and maintenance, is one of the midpoints of that grid. The ideal parent is situated between love and change. The rebel between change and will. We can see Crowley was definitely a rebel. And will and maintenance is what makes a good manager. And so we can see that these subpersonalities are constantly moving around within us between these scalar points of love and will, maintenance and change. Gina Hardy also looks at the Kabbalah in terms of the self and the higher self, and she sees this as towards the top of the tree of life, intellect and knowledge, which is obviously Darth on the tree of life. It literally means knowledge. Emotion she places between Geburah and Hesed, and action down in the lower world between Hod and Netzach. And of course, this is more to do with a tree of life that is purely looking at the psyche and its relationship to the world. So if we were to look at Jacob's ladder with the 4 trees of life, this is the second tree up and not the entirety of the tree of life itself. It's one of the 4 trees on a ladder if we make that ladder of the 4 worlds. And this is where we get into the intricacies of Kabbalah and occult psychology. Which level are we talking about? And as Ken Wilber called it, which part of the spectrum of consciousness are we talking about when we're talking about the self, the personality, identity, the intellect, and our emotional world and our spiritual world? How do these all connect? In this lesser seen Kabbalistic model developed by Aleister Crowley, dictated to Norman Mudd, so out of the top of his head, so perhaps that's why it's rarely been published. Perhaps it still needs some work on it. We can see that the self is at the top of the tree of life. This is not the self, the usual state of consciousness, which is in the middle of the tree of life as Tifreth, the human ego, but the concealed self, the hidden God, the self in connection with everything else, the unified self. And without going into too much detail, we can see that we have love on the path of the Empress up at the top of the tree of life as being one of the most preeminent expressions of self. And we can see that that arises between will, which is the self expressed in creative action, and the understanding, which is when the self is expressed in, as Crowley puts it, an intelligible form. The will is so pure, it really doesn't have words to it. It is the motivational, the directional principle of our expression, and it becomes and arises within us before words, before thoughts even, before understanding. This is why it's important to understand what we do and why we do it, so that we can again take hold of the tiller and guide ourselves into the future with a better will, with a more direct will, with more understanding. But we're doing that through a retrospective psychoanalytical examination of our behavior, of our tendencies, of our drives, of our attachments, and then we can move into a more existential and even transpersonal world by taking hold of that tiller. And then Crowley, towards the bottom of the tree of life, starts to talk about the illusion in thought and the illusion caused by the operation of all of the above forces in form. And this is basically where our more base passions arise, and Crowley gives all of these a place on the tree of life. None are higher or lower than the others. They all have a function within the hierarchy and within the system itself. So our generative forces, which is, as Crowley puts it, an illusionary reflection of the ego consciousness, we feel as if we're being driven by those when in fact we are a consciousness that is responding to those generative forces within us, that arises as passion. And as Crowley points out, that passion is aroused by the conflict of the illusions of dissatisfaction. So all of our lack of awareness of our holistic nature gives rise to a sense of dissatisfaction. It gives sense to illusion. We feel that we are separate in one way or another. And psychology helps with that. It helps us identify our drivers, our motivations, but it doesn't really look at necessarily goals or our will or our spiritual reality and our sense of blissful transcendence and even dissolution into a cosmic all. And Crowley and psychosynthesis tries to map that into the whole model. And Crowley comprehended that as well. He wanted an entire system that took account of all of these different aspects of ourself, a true occult psychology. And we can see down at the bottom we have the animal soul, which is a nod to the Kabbalistic idea of the levels of the soul, the ruach, the nefesh, and the chia, and so forth, where we have lots of different levels of the soul. This is something that goes back all the way to ancient Egypt, where there were lots of different aspects of the self, for example, the ba and the ka and the ak, and all of these are seen as our shadow, our sense of self, even our name, which is, as we would call it nowadays, our state of identity. We recognize our name when it's called across a wide area. We respond to that. It draws our attention. And therefore, it's an important aspect of our self. And this is why in ancient Egypt, there was also sometimes a secret name that wasn't revealed to people either. Okay, so let's take a look at these mysterious wheel sticks. I hope if you've chosen a number between 1 and 10, you remember that number, because what the wheel sticks are is a little exercise to break into our kunda buffers in Gurdjieffian terms, our sense of habit and routine. Gurdjieff used to do a lot of exercises where you would just stop for a second and observe exactly how you were holding your hands, how your head was tilted, and more importantly, what you were thinking at that moment, and whether you were truly in the moment or thinking about your shopping list or something that wasn't currently present. And these stop exercises allow you to break into that thought pattern and begin to loosen its grip upon you as a habitual state. So these are all designed to do that, and more importantly, they're designed to be a challenge for an hour or for a moment or for a day, depending on how you want to take them. So if you chose number 1, today I want you to observe and concentrate and then break a habit. So perhaps you automatically notice that the way you pour the kettle, if you make a drink for yourself, is in a particular way, and that's habitual. You don't think about reaching out for the kettle. So today, if you chose number 1, I want you to break that habit and actually, as you reach for the kettle, suddenly switch to your other hand or anything that breaks the habit. You can even just put your hand up, and then as long as you put a break into that habit, that's the important thing. If you chose number 2, you must begin today at once an action that you were about to postpone. So instead of postponing it, begin it. It doesn't matter if you continue it, you just need to begin it. Do the first thing of the thing that you were about to procrastinate about or postpone. If you chose number 3, when facing a minor choice, choose without hesitation. So instead of thinking about a choice today that you're given, for example, did you want to order Chinese or Indian food, just immediately say the answer. Just immediately say it without any hesitation. Number 5, Carry out an action, choose an action today as if it were your last, with complete conviction, passion and attention. Carry out an action as if it were your last, with complete conviction, passion and attention. So choose the action, whether it be doing the dishes or something far more pleasurable, but do it as if your life counted on it. So that was number 4. If you chose number 5, make a plan of several steps and follow it to the letter. Again, we're activating a slightly different form of attention here, where you are attending to make a plan, because planning is an action. Being a Thelemite doesn't mean that you can't have a plan, or working with constant attentive will doesn't mean you can't have a plan. You just will the plan and then will to follow your attention to the plan to which you have attended. So if you chose number 5, make a plan of several steps and follow it to the letter, even if it's for a simple activity. Number 6, do something you have never done before. This means that you're going to challenge your habitual nature. And this is where the Dice Man technique comes in. That sort of takes this will stick and takes it into a whole new lifestyle and way of discovering a lot about yourself and the nature of the universe. So if you've chosen number 6, then do something you have never done before. Number 7, act contrary to expectations in a particular circumstance. Maybe a social one if you dare, and again you can see a bit of the Dice Man type of technique, but act contrary to what people expect you to do. And this is an interesting one that begins to look at, as we saw with the video on the Dice Man technique, that other people's expectations are part of your habitual nature as well. They are what make you you, and therefore also need examining, breaking, disassociating from, so that you can begin to get a pure sense of self away from all of those things before it takes on all of these layers. So that was 2, 4, 6, 7. Number 8, eliminate something superfluous in your life, something small or something big, up to you, but something that you don't need, just tidy it away or get rid of it, throw it away. Eliminate something superfluous. And again, if you recall from the video of NLP that we did, then this is really looking at values. What is superfluous? Well, you need to examine your values and beliefs in order to have a hierarchy of your own values. So eliminate something superfluous is number 8. I wonder if these have Kabbalistic correspondences. 2, 4, 6, 8. Number 9, keep doing something for 5 extra minutes if you feel an attraction to do something else, or tired of the activity, or feel you cannot continue. So this is more like, I guess, a workout type method. Keep doing something for 5 extra minutes, as long as you can continue to do it safely, of course. Then keep doing something for 5 extra minutes and just see what happens when you push yourself beyond your habitual end point, your habitual exhaustion point. And in particular, something that perhaps you find where you're losing attention to it, tired of the activity, feel you can't continue because you're drifting. Again, as long as it's safe to do it, try doing it for 5 more minutes and see what happens. So that was 2, 4, 6. That was number 9, wasn't it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that was number 9. Then finally, number 10. Postpone an action you were about to begin, but make it a deliberate postponement. Say, I'm not going to do that today, I will do that tomorrow, or I will do that another time. So just postpone an action you were about to begin, but do it with all of your will, all of your intention, and with all of your might. So that was for those who chosen number 10. There are a few more will sticks as well, about 17 of them, and those are some of the examples where we can actually work on what we're doing, what we are attending to, and begin to understand our own occult psychology. So what really is occult psychology? Well, I guess it's a form of psychology that takes into account occult, mystical and spiritual experience. This book here, The Spiral Path, or Spiritual Psychology by Edith B. Schnapper, is a really nice, clear book on this very subject. It talks about the spiritual psychology begins at the point where we stand at the present moment. In fact, when we become aware of dissatisfaction, a feeling of unease or even repulsion. Increasingly, or all of a sudden, life looks shallow without meaning and purpose. Something, we know not what, has awakened in us, instigating a negative attitude to life. And then we begin our spiral path to find wholeness, comprehensiveness, consistency and congruence to what the truth of our actual lived experience might be. And that's all of our experience, even the mystical and the spiritual. And Schnapper makes these points that we begin with aspiration, which we've just been looking at in terms of will. Identification is one of the things where we are looking at all of our models, our spiritual models, and models of the self to see where we are identifying with, where we search for guidance, where we receive transmission, where we go through different stages of identity and eventually come to appreciate consciousness, communion and union, and then final identity as the whole at the top of the tree, because obviously this can be modelled by the tree of life as well as any other model. And Schnapper really makes an interesting point here about the methods by which we use. And she says the discipline of mindfulness, for example, is a potent instrument, but it is not an end to itself. To regard it as such leads to an inevitable arrest of progress in the spiritual path. But there exists a spiritual law which applies universally. It is that the aids that we employ in support of our search for truth necessarily change. A discipline that has helped us at a certain point becomes obsolete. It even becomes a hindrance to further progress. We have to walk on and leave it behind. It's a really important point, and one of the many she makes in this that applies to the initiatory system that I teach in the Western Esoteric initiatory system, which is that these are scaffolds and ladders, mindfulness, yoga, all of the techniques that we use, even ritual, evocation, summoning, dream work and so forth, they all have their place. They are all rungs of the ladder. But eventually we set the ladder aside when we have got to where we are using the ladder to get us to. And so it's a really important point, and one of many she makes in this very, very clear book. And Bennett and Gurdjieff talked about a spiritual psychology as well. And in their case, it's basically looking at the model of humans in a sort of simpler form than we've looked at in the Tree of Life and so forth. A very basic model here of spirit, soul and body, where we have a set of workings and a set of approaches, the fourth way work, the work as it's more simply called with a capital, that we are seeking to become aware of ourselves in our activity, and as a result be fully conscious, fully aware, and begin to break down the attachments that we have to all of these different sub-personalities. And standard psychology of all forms, I'm all for counselling, therapy work and so forth. They're an important part of the life of the occultist, because occult experience can put a lot of strain on the psyche, and we have to build ourselves in a fairly clear way so we know what we are removing later. It's sort of, we have to really identify these parts of ourselves so that we don't go entirely overboard later on in the work when we remove one part of ourselves or an attachment or an identity structure, and find another construct comes into place, and that construct completely takes over and we're not aware of it at all. And I've seen many an occultist who is eaten by their own construct, and they have no idea that has actually gone on. And usually there's a sense of certainty about that person, about who they are, what they're teaching and so forth, and there is no weakness, curiosity, openness and passion and authenticity, I guess. There's just the construct, and that can be very scary. It's one of Aleister Crowley's definitions of a black brother when they had tried to get rid of their entire self, but there's been one speck left, and that speck has then enlarged itself and eaten the person alive. As Asigoli said, there is no certainty, there is only adventure. And I think it's really important to, particularly when you're following the spiral path and looking for a teacher or a guide. I think it was in Karate Kid or something like that. Never trust a guru who doesn't dance, and doesn't dance badly necessarily. I think it's really important to find a teacher who can guide you with a certain form of discipline and not giving you a gap to escape and being quite harsh and ruthless in that regard, but also somebody who is still at least learning themselves and has that curiosity and openness that is still showing a growth and awareness of our limitations in what we can know about ourselves, what we can know about the universe, and isn't absolutely dead certain of a particular model, because all of these things are rungs of the ladder. It's like someone trying to sell you just one rung of a ladder, and it doesn't matter how well painted it is, how extravagant it is, what they promise you to do. It is just one rung of somebody else's ladder, and it's really important to, yeah, you can take that rung and put it on your own ladder somewhere, and it might have a place, but when someone is telling you this is the entire ladder and is sure about it, then you just leave them to their rung. They're fine where they are, and you haven't got time to move your attention, your time, and your potential attachment to that, because it's far more important to, as I always say, to take the map and to use it as an escape plan out of the illusion, and not to just wallpaper the cell and use it as some sort of award or notional identity. And I think this is one of the big lessons of occult psychology as opposed to regular psychology, that regular psychology is part of a whole transition, is part of a whole model. And we have to look beyond that in terms of the occult, which literally means unknown, in the same way that psychology means the soul. And certainly when I studied psychology at college and was looking to get into that field, then I was very disappointed to find it was more about how you perform a study, select a sample size, what the statistical definition of an audience and sample size is, what a longitudinal as opposed to a latitudinal study might be, and so forth. And it was nothing to do with the soul. It was we barely touched on Jung. So I think occult psychology is a open field, a growing field, a developmental one, has lots of different approaches to it, but it's something I'd certainly say is worth you taking a look at. And again, I hope I've recommended some books. Psychosynthesis is a good place to start. It's a very clear approach to occult psychology or mystical or spiritual psychology, and then perhaps you can build from there. So as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop. I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Any questions, just ask them below. Thanks a lot.